Good afternoon to you all, wherever you may be. My name is Dr Aarti Anhal, and today I'm going to be welcoming you and taking you through this webinar run by the We Are Virtual Initiative and the We Are the City team on sustaining resilience. Now, depending on where you are, you may not have sunshine, you may have really downcast rain, which is what we have in London. But as you can see, the lady on the screen is actually holding a sunflower, and I propose to bring you just a little bit of sunshine today, and really through the idea of hope. Now, hope as a psychological concept is more than just wishful thinking. It's actually having the will to achieve something and then having the way to achieve it. And the fact that you've all joined this webinar today suggests that actually you really do have the will, you really would like to understand your current resilience levels and actually look to increase and sustain them. At the end of it, what I'm really hoping to give you is actually the way, the pathways to actually building on that resilience. So, who am I? My name is Dr Aarti Anhal, and I run a company called Before 9. I am a positive psychology and coaching psychology practitioner who, up until 3 years ago, worked in the cut and thrust of business, worked primarily in risk and crisis management. So 10 years ago, I was helping organisations with swine flu. There's actually a video of me on the ITN news talking about hand washing and desks being a certain distance apart, which feels like a very long time ago now. But 3 years ago, I moved from operational and organisational resilience within businesses to people performance, because I really felt that until we understand how people think and feel and behave and how to bring the best out of human beings and their performance, we really can't deliver sustainable businesses and organisations going forward. So the work that my team and I do is really based under this kind of mantra that we have, which is that we want to help individuals to be well, teams to actually work well, and organisations to create a community where people can thrive together. And you can see there some of the elements that we work on developing, sustaining for our clients, both through coaching, one-to-one and team coaching, but also through training and consultancy. And the reason that actually I felt that it was so important to bring my old world of psychological and organisational resilience with my new world together is that what we really see in organisations is there are three common contexts. So the first one is business as usual. I'm not sure I'll ever really get to use the word business as usual anymore, but a new operational rhythm. There's times of organisational change, which can create really challenging, but also great opportunity moments for organisations, but that needs to be managed well. And then there are also major incidents and crises, such as the one we're living through at the moment, which actually require us to really think about how we can best be well, work well, and thrive. So what we're actually going to do today is firstly just create a space for the We Are the City network to come together virtually. That's one intention, and by you being here, we've really been able to do that. And really, why do we want to do that? It's because we want to give you some really practical, evidence-based framework and tools for some of the elements that can really be quite crucial in underpinning your resilience, both today, but also going forward over the following weeks and months, and perhaps even tools that you'll use for the rest of your life. And the tools that we'll be looking at in particular are those around helping you to gain greater perspective when you're looking at situations and thinking in a certain way, how to kind of explore success and failure, and actually how to build our levels of optimism. So the idea is that I'm pretty much going to talk for the next 40 minutes or so, and then we will have a final Q&A session. So what I would like to ask you to do throughout the session is that if you have any specific technical issues, please just go into the chat box and actually enter them there, and someone from the We Are the City team there will pick up with you. As you have any reflections, thoughts, questions that you'd like to pose, please put them into the Q&A tab, which you'll find running along either the bottom of your control panel, some of you might have that at the bottom. And we will also be using a tool called Minty.com. And what I'd like to ask all of you to do right now is, you're on your laptops, hopefully, and you've either got a phone or perhaps you're on your phone, but you can open up a web browser. In your phone, I'd like you to enter into a browser the website www.minty.com. And what we're going to do throughout the webinar is just capture some of your input and your engagement in the session today, so that we can learn from each other. And we will do that anonymously. So feel free to share whatever you want to share when it comes to being asked to share. And actually, let's do that straight away. So what I'd like you to do, once you've gone into www.minty.com, is you'll see that you're being asked to provide a code. And the code I would like you to use is written on the screen here. It's 309238. And once you've entered that code, you'll see that you're being asked a question and you've been given a text box. And the question that I'd like you to answer is, which one way of thinking or feeling or behaving would you like to ideally change this week? So it may be something that's affecting you personally in terms of a way of thinking or feeling. It may be something that if you're running your own business, you'd like to feel differently about. Perhaps it's actually as a leader. Perhaps it's actually as a parent. Whatever role or whatever part of you is actually saying, there's something I'd really like to improve. What is it that you'd like to do? And actually, if you want to, in brackets, just put at the end of that in the text box where you're dialing in from. We can also just get a sense of the community that we're sharing the space with today. So as you're doing that, I'm actually going to pull up the results so that we can all look at those together. Let's see. So we've already got procrastination, overwhelm. I'd like to feel more level. I feel bored with work. I want to feel less lonely and isolated. Feel less pulled in all directions. Feeling like I'm overweight, feeling vulnerable about my income and future work, having more patience with helping my children with the homeschooling aspects of the work we're having to do, trying to be more creative and productive, currently feeling there's no light at the end of the tunnel with working from home. I'd like to stop counting the days down so much, feeling that what I'm doing is pointless, improving my self-confidence, focusing on motivation. Hello, Birmingham. There we go. London. Fantastic. Thank you for sharing all of these. So far we've got really, crying uncontrollably when you start arguing, feeling concerned about workload because others have been furloughed. Hello, Nazing in Essex. Thank you. What we can see here are real trends around the common human experience of what we're going through at the moment. Aspects of how furloughing process affects us and others, how our work suddenly starts to feel more or less meaningful, how we start to feel that actually we don't want to deal with some of the difficult stuff today, we want to put it off. Feeling frustrated, isolated, lonely. These are very natural challenges that we're experiencing right now. Now, there have been some great webinars already around self-care and well-being, and you may have already been able to access those either on YouTube or watch them at the time. Today's session shows you that actually we're all in similar situations in terms of feeling that there are things we would like to improve. And what I would really like to do today is to give you some tools that help you to understand where you're at today when it comes to your resilience, and really help you to define resilience, because I think there's so much around the buzzword of resilience that gets very misunderstood. So we're going to take a real psychology-based approach to that today. And then we're going to look at how your thinking really can impact the way that you feel and then the way that you behave. So thank you so much for sharing that and for being so honest. I know that even being able to share it and hopefully see that other people are also struggling helps to give you a sense of perspective that there are days where we're all struggling with something. So the first thing I'd like to do really is to define resilience, because I think that there is a lot of misconception around this. And the interesting thing is that there are actually 122 psychology-based researched definitions of resilience. I'm not going to show you all 122, but what I am going to do is highlight some that I think you might find helpful to think differently about your resilience. So the first one is by a great resilience coach, Dr. Carol Pemberton, and she talks about personal resilience. So the resilience we need day in, day out throughout our lives. And what you can see here is that she's really talking about this as a capability to remain flexible. So she's talking about flexibility in how we think, feel, and behave when we go through periods of pressure or change or disruption. And she also focuses not only on what we need to do to be resilient, the flexibility we need to show, but she also talks about the outcome or the state that we want to be in when we're feeling resilient. She says it's so that we can emerge being stronger, and wiser and more able. I know that for many of you, there will already have been so much that you have learned about yourself in the last 4 to 5 weeks. And I want you to take a moment here to think about what you've learned, because actually that's a demonstration that you have actually been resilient in these last few weeks. In fact, you've been resilient to some extent your whole life based on what you've experienced. What is it that you're seeing in terms of what you're learning? But actually what you can see in her definition is what we call the 3 R's. And those 3 R's are that we have to be able to resist what's going on. So we have to be able to stand strong and dig deep and continue with what we're being asked to deal with or face. But that on its own is not enough. If it was all just about digging deep, we could be stubborn, single-minded, dogged, and it would get us through. That alone isn't enough. It's just something that helps us keep powering on. The second R is actually recovery. We need to adapt to the situation. And when we mean adapt, we mean this flexibility in how we think, feel, and behave. So we need to recognize that we're in a different situation than we were in before, that actually that means we're going to have to do things differently and to feel okay about that. And the third R is actually reconfiguration. It's learning and development and growth that comes as a result of what we've experienced. So right now, I'm sure that there is a certain amount of digging deep. There may be some adaptation. Hopefully there's some learning. And I want you, as we go through this, to really think about that, the digging deep, the adapting, and the learning, because it is all part of resilience. Now, for those of you that are juggling being who we are and dealing with what we're dealing with in life, with the fact that we are someone's employee or we are a leader, what does resilience mean in that context? Here we're starting to look at actually what you would expect to see. So managing the stress at work. How does work create stress? Well, there are demands. There's a working environment. There are working patterns. There are relationships in that workplace that can create stress. There are resources, the lack of which can mean that we're actually put under more stress. So resilience from an employee perspective is starting to think about digging deep, adapting and learning from the stresses that we're facing at work, the challenges we're facing at work. And then, as you can see from this particular definition, another fabulous woman, Dr. Catherine McEwen, it's about what you do to learn and prepare for the next time things may go wrong. So it's taking the learning and saying, next time I experience a difficult conversation or I have to think about structuring my day, what have I learned that means I'm going to do it better this time? And the final definition I want to talk to you about is psychological resilience. So that is really talking about how we use this general resilience in our flexibility and ways of thinking, feeling, and being to then be able to sustain a level of performance, which I like to call optimal performance, and that's what it's called in positive psychology. It's optimal performance, meaning high, but sustainable in a way that respects your physical and your mental health. Now, when you think about those definitions, they are often at odds with the ones we get told about when we hear about leaders in the press. Oh, they're so resilient. They were so single-minded. I hope you now can see that that's not resilience. Resilience really is flexibility. We created a model at Before 9 that took into account some of the science around the building blocks that go into making us resilient. And so that's the really interesting thing. Resilience is not a personality type. And it's not even a static thing. It's dynamic. It changes over time, which means that how you feel today may be very different from last week, and how you feel next week will also potentially be different in terms of resilience levels. And actually, if you can think of an analogy, resilience here is really like leadership or emotional intelligence. It's not one thing that makes you resilient. It's a whole range of capabilities and competencies and aspects of who we are and how we do things that creates good leadership, that creates emotional intelligence, and as such creates resilience as well. So as I talk through these, hopefully you can see through these blocks how potentially resilient you are at the moment, or where you could look to make potential adjustments. So well-being is absolutely a considerable part of this, talking about mental health and physical health and feeling good and functioning well and productively. And that's where the role of stress management really comes into play. So if you're feeling at the moment that actually the part that's lacking is well-being, then I would urge you to look at resources available to you that can help you think about self-care, structuring your workday, given also your homeschooling and family and personal commitments. Perspective is something we're going to look at today, and that is really about how do we define the story in our heads about what we're experiencing? And then how does that affect how we feel and behave? Because resilient people may experience the same thing as you. They may just be telling themselves a different story about that situation. The third building block is regulation of our emotions. So that's not simply just controlling them and saying, I'm not going to get angry and I'm not going to cry. It's actually recognizing that you're angry or recognizing that you want to cry, but finding a technique or a tool that helps you to accept that emotion, move through that emotion, and proceed based on how you feel. Values and strengths. So a lot of the evidence we find about resilience is that the people who feel that they're living authentically, in line with their values, and also who are getting to use their human strengths or character strengths, as we call them in positive psychology, really being themselves, find themselves to be more resilient because they have these resources they can pull on. Now, for some of you who might be working in organizations under real pressure and real challenge, perhaps who are moving in a direction that you really don't agree with and that really conflicts with your values, I think there's probably something here around how can you look at the way in which the rest of your life is proceeding in line with your values, even if the work you're doing at the moment feels like a temporary disalignment. Purpose and belonging. I think this is one of probably the biggest challenges at the moment, is that we've gone from feeling like we belong in a workplace environment, together with colleagues, together with our communities. And suddenly, when we're all working remotely and virtually, it can be very hard to maintain a sense of belonging and a sense of team, which is why creating virtual networks and connections like today, but also with your colleagues, is so important. Because belonging and feeling that we know why we're here and that we know that we matter to the group, to the organization, helps us to feel that we have a reason to get out of bed, to function well. And actually, if you feel that you're lacking in purpose at the moment, that potentially means that perhaps you're working for a leader who hasn't articulated how valuable and how important your role is. And I would urge you to ask for clarity, because purpose really is about getting clarity about why you matter and what your role is. If you're a leader, conversely, really one of the ways you can boost the resilience of your teams is to help clarify the purpose during the current time of what they are meant to do and how it makes a difference. Optimistic thinking, that's something we're also going to look at today. I'm sure that if I asked those of you on the call to actually tell me whether you thought you were an optimist, a pessimist, or someone who hadn't made up their mind yet, in my workshops, I tend to get a raise of hands of maybe 7 people saying they're an optimist, 2 people saying they're pessimist, and 1 person saying they haven't made up their mind. But the good news is there are ways to actually build optimism. Like resilience, it's not static, and it's also not something that is fixed, it can be learned. Connection, I think at the moment we're all searching for connection, and that's one of the big things that is a building block for our resilience. And finally, flexibility, doing things differently, looking at success and failure differently. These are the building blocks. And what I'd ask you to think about is 4 ways in which you could look at these building blocks being present in your life right now. There are the skills you have that are created from these building blocks. Skills that are gifts you've accessed within yourself. So gratitude, humor, courage, bravery, optimism. Then there are the strategies that you have in place in your life that may be based on these particular building blocks. So the way that you manage your time and structure your day, journaling, or doing a 3 good things exercise to feel grateful. That's a strategy to then have a skill. Dancing around the kitchen is my personal favorite. That's a strategy I use to help build my sense of feeling good and functioning well, my well-being. What strategies do you have? The third section really for building these blocks is actually support. So this is where family, friends, your support networks come in. It's where your exercise regimes come in. It's where your faith potentially really helps you. And then the final one of those 4 ways of thinking about how to structure this resilience is something called sagacity, Sagacity, sagacity. And that is really the wisdom that really speaks to you. So I'm sure you all have a song that is your song for getting up, kicking ass, and actually feeling great about walking into a meeting, delivering a presentation, or just something that really makes you feel good. That's a song that represents sagacity. It's speaking to you. It means something to you. Similarly, we have family sayings that actually maybe are passed down from generation to generation, or poems. What is it that speaks to you that you can use to really guide and inspire you through the current time? So if that's the building blocks, what I want to focus in specifically now is the idea of the storytelling. Now, those of you that are familiar with Brené Brown, the fantastic social science researcher based out of Austin, Texas, and who've watched her TED Talks will know that she's a great researcher on vulnerability and shame and daring and courage. And the one line that she says, which I love, is really, if you had to boil resilience down to one thing, it's the story we tell ourselves. And anyone in psychology will tell you that the way that we formulate everything we do is usually based on a thought that creates an emotion, that creates a behavior. So if we take procrastination, procrastination is a behavior. What we need to understand is what is the thinking and the emotion driving the procrastination. Or if we're thinking about isolation, as perhaps maybe I feel isolated and disconnected, maybe that's an emotional response. We need to think about the thinking that's gone into feeling that emotion. And this is, I guess, always the point where I provide a huge caveat. And that's to say that what I'm about to show you is not here to say that we must get rid of every negative thought we have. Negative thinking is really important for giving us signals as to when something is not right, something needs addressing, something needs to change. It's absolutely part of our fear and our human survival response. But by understanding how we think and challenging our thinking, we can actually develop a perspective that allows us to see a fuller picture, not just potentially the negative, but also the positive, so that we see the whole. Because particularly in challenging times like the one we're facing with COVID-19, we're actually perhaps focusing on only a part of the picture. So let's look at this in practice. We all have default thinking patterns. I remember a great lecturer on my master's program talking about the difference between pits and pets. So the pits we fall into are performance interfering thoughts, thinking that gets in the way. What we want is we want to turn them into pets, performance enhancing thoughts. So let's take a look at these. And as I go through them, just start to think about the ones that feel relevant for you. So the first set of pits is where we are either minimizing or catastrophizing a particular situation. Minimizing is, oh, this has got nothing to do with me. This is not going to have any bearing on how I need to live my life. This is tiny, tiny issue, when actually perhaps it's a big issue. Catastrophizing, which I think a lot more people can relate to, is absolutely saying, this is the worst thing that could ever happen. This is going to be a nightmare. This is going to be the end of our business. This is going to be a doom and gloom situation for my family. Catastrophizing. The next one is almost a filtering that we do based on a negativity bias, where we can notice failures, but we can't see success. I wonder how many of you at the end of the day think purely about the things that you weren't able to achieve. I didn't really homeschool my child very well today. I didn't take time to do X. What were all the successes in that day? How could you focus more on those successes rather than on just the two things that you didn't do as well as you would like to have done? Oversimplifying. I think a lot of people do this too. It's very much, she's a brilliant boss, I'm an awful boss. Or he's a great husband, I'm an awful wife. Complete oversimplification. Labeling. I think this is something that women in particular can be guilty of doing. I'm not a communicator, but I'm not a leader. I'm not great at. I'm not good at. How many labels do you find yourself giving yourself? Perhaps the common one at the moment is I'm not a good mother, which is both oversimplifying and also labeling yourself. All or nothing thinking. So this is really about, unless it's perfect, it's a failure. An example of this would be, I spent 2 hours working on that report, and because I didn't finish it, it was a complete waste of time. Rather than, actually, the fact that I got 80% of the way through that report means that I only have 20% left. Could relate that to homeschooling. The fact that actually I really didn't get through a whole set of teaching materials today means that that was a complete waste of my time and my child didn't learn anything. Actually, what did your child learn through the amount that you got through? Responsibility shifts. I think in the workplace, this one is rather significant, and again, perhaps more relevant for women. In the people I coach, I often find that there's a quite clear distinction. So men can sometimes be guilty of the blaming responsibility shift, which is, if they hadn't done that, I wouldn't have had to do what I needed to do. So it's their fault, they left me with no choice. Personalization is the email you sent to a director that hasn't been replied to in 48 hours. And the thinking that you have over that 48 hours is, it's me, it's the email I wrote, it's the way I formatted it, it's the content of the email. That director doesn't like me anyway. Oh, and by the way, that director didn't say hello to me when I walked down the corridor last week. Personalization, it's all about me. I must have done something wrong, which actually is the height of egotism, because it's really thinking that we're the center of the universe and that that's the only possible reason for why something has happened. Jumping to conclusions. This is an interesting one. We have two versions here. We have mind reading and we have fortune telling. Mind reading is making negative associations in the present without any factual evidence. She doesn't like me. They think I'm not good enough. They don't respect me. That's mind reading. Fortune telling is a future association you're making with no factual evidence. So they are not going to understand why I did this. They are going to think that I'm a really bad person or a bad boss or a bad mother. Overgeneralization. This is something that I often see in organizations, and it becomes very tribal, but I think we also do it as individuals, which is why it then gets infectious around a team. They never do that for me. They always do that for that department. We are all going to be in a really difficult situation. We never get the budget we need. I never get given the credit for being the mother that I am. Overgeneralizing. Necessity. So the number of times that you've said, I have to do this, I must do this, as if that's the reason, the necessity is the reason, without stepping back to understand, was there a necessity or need there? And then the final one is one called emotional reasoning. And this one is, I feel embarrassed, so I must have done a really bad job. I'm feeling guilty about this, so they must all hate me. The fact that you link how you feel to a given situation. Now, taking into account those particular pits, there's a one that I'm seeing a lot of in the current time, and that is either or thinking. So really this idea that it is either the worst of times or it's the best of times, when actually it's probably both for all of us. The worst of times in some ways, the best of times in other ways. We're all in this together, and you know, we're kind of not, because my situation is unique. There are challenges and there are opportunities. How many times have you found yourself thinking on one side or the other without recognizing that there's probably a fuller picture here for you of what you're experiencing right now? Now, what I'd like you to do is to go back into Minty. So kind of go back into that website or refresh the browser so that you've brought it up again. And this time I would like you to enter a new code into Minty. And you can see the code there. It's 849872. And this time, I'd just like you to share some of the pits that you recognize in yourselves, because I think it would just be great for us to see some trends, potential patterns, and then I can focus in the next section on how to overcome these thinking traps with that in mind. So as you're doing that, 849872, I will just show what we've got here. And for anyone who still doesn't have the code, you can see it now on my screen through this particular slide. Overthinking, all or nothing thinking, labeling. Yep, I think a lot of us have labeled ourselves at some time. Personalizing, blaming, all or nothing, fortune telling, loads of them. All, I'm afraid, no, thank you for being so honest. The amount of times I get people at the moment saying all of them. It's completely human. It's natural. Mind reading, overthinking. So we've got a lot of mind reading, quite a bit of labeling, mental filtering, labeling. They're not going to think I'm competent enough. Right, so either they're currently not thinking I'm competent enough, or the fortune telling of they are not going to think that I'm competent enough if I don't do X, so I need to do X now. And that's the thing. What you can hopefully see here is that actually, when you start to have this never feels like it is going to get better. Yeah, when will it end? Fear and afraid, all of them. And I swing between extremes in my thoughts and emotions. Thank you really so much for sharing that. So what I'm going to do, just to see if there's anything else there, is I'm going to move straight into how we can coach ourselves through these particular thinking traps. Emotional reasoning there we go. Great, thank you. Hopefully, by having seen that, you will realize that you are not alone. there are, to use and thinking, we are all in this together. We are all going through a whole range of thinking traps. And yet there will be many specific reasons why you experience the thinking traps that you experience based on your past experiences, perhaps the culture in your workplace. But what we can do is help you to challenge those thinking traps. Now, these are the challenges that we usually ask as coaches when we hear thinking traps in others, or therapists ask them when they've got a patient who's come to them for therapy. But these are the kinds of questions, and I will talk through them, that you can ask yourself when you find yourself thinking that way. These are questions that you can ask of your family members when you hear them thinking that way. And if you're working in an organization and you're a leader, these are questions that you absolutely can ask of your team to help them overcome some of the thinking traps they have. So let's start with I know that, which is usually linked to mind reading and fortune telling. I know that they are going to think that I am stupid. I know that they will think I haven't done a good job. I know that they think I'm bad. I know that I'm not a good communicator. The question you need to ask yourself is, how specifically do you know that? How do you know that? Who says that? Who in particular has said that about you, or gives you the impression that they're going to think that? Where is the evidence? As coaches, what we're always looking to do is help people to find the evidence for their thinking. Where is the evidence that they're going to think you're stupid? Where is the evidence for the fact that they're not going to think you're productive enough? The next one is when we think we're forced into a situation. I must do this, I should do this. What is forcing you to do that? Is it them? Is it you? Is it a part of you? Which part of you is forcing yourself to do it? Is it your ego that's forcing you to overwork because actually you want to show everyone that you're brilliant, even though now is a time when most people probably will accept that not everyone is going to be brilliant? Is it an insecurity that's forcing you? And actually, one of the things I find very helpful for planning, taking yourself through a planning process here to decide whether you need to do something, is to say, what happens if you do it? What happens if you don't? Really challenge yourself. What happens if I don't do it? Usually the answer is, no one dies. The world is not going to cave in. It's the end of the world. So I think at the moment, it's very natural to feel that actually we're living through something very catastrophic. And for some people, it is far more catastrophic than others. But as a human race, we have been through many challenging things before, and we are resilient, and we will get through this. It's just going to take challenge and adapting. So when you think to yourself, I'm not going to have a job at the end of next week, now there may be really good evidence for the fact that you may not have a job. But what you can start to do is think in a solution-focused way about what actually you're going to do to actually help that situation or correct that. But when you're starting to make sweeping statements of this is going to be the end of humanity and this is going to be a nightmare for my family, we will never recover, I want you to ask yourself, what are the chances that that will happen? What are actually the chances that that will happen? And if you still feel that the anxiety of the what ifs is feeling very difficult, one of the most common techniques in helping people with anxiety is to actually force them to answer the question, what is the best thing that could happen? What is the best thing that could happen to you in your job right now? What is the best thing that could happen to you in your family right now? Closeness, improved collaboration, increased empathy and connection, more compassion, better understanding, business opportunities that we never saw coming. What are the best things? Now, you may not be able to line yourself up with that thinking, but the science shows that even by going to that place, you will no longer be in the catastrophizing zone. You will probably be somewhere in the middle. Now, when people say always and all never, they never give us the budget. My boss never gives me the credit. My husband never thanks me. Really? That is always the question I will ask. Really? And then you have to really search within yourself to find the counter evidence. Where are the times where you did get the budget? Where are the times when you did get the credit? Where are the times when you did get the thank you? They may be there, but we just aren't forcing ourselves to look for them. The final one is I feel, therefore I am. So this can be the emotional reasoning part. And in this section, really, it's about understanding that everything you are thinking and feeling will have a benefit to you. So maybe it feels comfortable. Maybe it feels easy to think that way. Maybe it feels like at the moment it helps you to just deal with something. I had someone yesterday I was coaching who said, the benefit to me of closing the curtains so I don't see people going to the beach, because I live by the beach, who are flouting social distancing, is to just close the curtains. And I said, okay, so how is that benefiting you? Well, it's benefiting me because I don't have to deal with it. And I don't have to get angry. And I said, well, what is it costing you? Well, I don't have any daylight. I said, okay, so let's look at those benefits and those costs. Is it worth it? Sometimes it's not about trying to avoid the situation. It's about learning to think differently about people who are flouting social distancing rules, which is, rather than they're completely irresponsible, they may be, is it any of your business? Would you rather deprive yourself of light and think it's your business? Or would you rather actually have sunlight and go, do you know what? It's none of my business. That's what I'm going to think every time I see that. And actually, if they're taking at-risk people out, they are responsible for those people. I'm not responsible for those people. Another way of really rebooting this way of thinking is to say to yourself, because we're all kinder to friends and colleagues than we are to ourselves, if a friend or colleague was thinking this way, what would I be saying to them? What questions would I ask them when they told me that they feel like it, they feel really embarrassed because they've done something wrong, which means they therefore must be really bad at their job? You'd be finding evidence, wouldn't you, to show them that they're wrong. How can you do that for yourself? And the last one there, and this is really, I guess, for people who are finding themselves focusing on something and it's taking up an inordinate amount of energy, is to say, look, this thought, this feeling, will this matter in X months or years? Or how will this matter? What effect will thinking and feeling this way still have many years down the line? So a lot of the thinking traps we have are actually linked to a fear of failure. And that's why I wanted to explore this a little bit in the last kind of 10 minutes that we have. I think particularly as women, we set ourselves up with such high standards, and actually we come from a culture where perhaps we're expected to be able to do so much. We're known as multitaskers. That's a label, if ever I heard one. You know, we're able to have it all. And actually what that means is we're constantly striving and very naturally scared of failing, which then affects our resilience, because when we do fail, the story we tell ourselves is potentially really undermining everything we think and feel about ourselves. And the first thing I wanted to say, which is a completely natural one, but I wanted to say it nonetheless, is that we don't seem to expect perfection from other people, but we expect it of others. I would like you to think about the number of times in the last 4 weeks you have eased up on other people. You have eased up on your standards or expectations of them. How have your standards and expectations changed of them? And then to think about the standards that you've had of yourselves. Have you eased up? Have you recognized that actually we're in a distressing time where it's completely natural for us to actually not be perfect? Sometimes, and I think this is always an interesting one, particularly around women in business and businesses generally, there are some really interesting statistics at how many businesses fail. And yet for some reason, we think that all businesses should succeed. And I wonder, for how many of you who are juggling homeschooling and parenting and working productively, how many of you think that you're completely expected and it's very natural to succeed in all of those aspects? Maybe right now the statistics for success are really low in terms of being able to be productive, maintain mental health, homeschool, cook for your families and do everything. So if you had to reduce your expectations for success, how far would you reduce them and what would you be prepared to sacrifice? Failure actually makes us more attractive to other people. If you haven't watched The Power of Vulnerability by Brené Brown, her TED Talk, I would really urge you to do so. We connect because we fail. We connect because we are failures. Now, I recognize some of you will work in a culture where that is not the case, but actually by and large for human beings, we need to recognize that actually wearing our failures, some of our failures are the best things that have ever happened to us. And they allow someone else to realize that we're not Teflon coated either. And that leads me to my next point. Some people think that success and failure are two different things, that something is either a success or it's a failure. And I would suggest that every coin you have has success on one side and failure on the other. If you are being a brilliant parent right now, tick, success, there is probably an element of failure in the workplace. If you are being brilliant in the workplace right now, There will be an element of failure in how you are managing and look after yourself. No one succeeds or fails at everything. So how can you start to look at your situation as the coin that has the two sides and recognizes the whole of that coin rather than just the heads or the tails? And I think by and large, the biggest lesson here is that it's very often not the failure that is the problem. It's the way we tell the story about the problem. And that's where I wanted to finish up really on linking into optimism. So optimists, when Martin Seligman, a great positive psychology kind of godfather, did the analysis on what differentiated optimists and pessimists, he found that what differentiated them was the way they told the stories about their successes and their failures. And therefore, he said, if we can understand that there are differences in how they talk about their successes and failures, we can help people build more optimism by changing the way they talk about their success and their failures. I'm going to finish with a really light scenario to explain this. So I've burnt the dinner, okay? I've burnt the dinner. Because I'm an optimist, it's highly likely that the way that I will talk about that setback is, I burnt the dinner. Doesn't mean I'm going to burn every dinner. And it's localized. Just because I burnt the dinner doesn't mean that I'm bad at everything else I do. And do you know what? I burnt the dinner, but it's not personal. It's not entirely my fault. Maybe I hadn't read the recipes correctly. Maybe the recipe was really badly written. Maybe my oven isn't being quite as effective as it normally is. Not all my fault. I was stressed. I was trying to manage my children at the same time. I cooked a brilliant dinner. Let's look at how an optimist talks about that victory. They will say to themselves, oh, I cooked a brilliant dinner. Do you know what? Because I cooked a brilliant dinner, I'll always cook brilliant dinners. I can really do this. I can do it all the time. And because I cook brilliant dinners, it's pervasive, this feeling. I can do other brilliant things brilliantly. And it's me. I'm going to recognize that actually I probably had a lot to do with cooking this brilliant dinner. Now, that's not to say that I'm not going to give credit to the fantastic Nigella Lawson recipe or to Waitrose for the fabulous ingredients, but I really did pull it all together. Pessimists do the complete reverse. And I'm sure as I've been talking you through this, you will have thought about yourself if you happen to be a pessimist or feeling pessimistic at the moment, which is that for them, any victory they have is temporary. It won't last. They won't always be able to cook great dinners. And even if they have a victory around cooking a great dinner, those pessimists will say, well, just because I did that doesn't mean I can do anything else brilliantly. And they won't take credit for their victories. So they will say, well, it really wasn't me. It was Nigella's recipe that did it. And yet when they have a setback, they burnt the dinner. A pessimist will say, I'm always going to burn dinners. And because I burn dinners, I do everything badly. And it was my fault. Now, if you're really interested in this, because I'm conscious I've given you a very quick talk through it, please look online for Learned Optimism, Martin Seligman, Optimism and Pessimism, because you can train yourself through your storytelling, through your successes and your failures, to build optimism. It's been proven that if you change the way you reframe your scenarios, you actually find that you have a lot of the positive aspects and results that are associated with optimism in terms of goal setting and positive thinking and well-being. So I want you now, the last moments, to really make a commitment to yourself. And I'm not going to ask you to put these on Minty. I'm actually going to ask you to write this down if you have pen and paper with you, because there are some great neural pathways that get opened up when we write things down. But your commitment to yourself really is that based on everything you've heard today, from what resilience is, the building blocks of resilience, the aspects you have across your skills, your support, your sagacity, your way of thinking, the thinking traps you have, everything that you've heard about how to overcome them, and how you've thought about success and failure, what one new way of thinking or proceeding can you adopt based on today? And when you've written that down, I will move into Q&A. So if you haven't...